Okay, we can go ahead and get started. My name is Jeff Handley. I'm going to talk to you today about my experience this year learning Node and React after spending 20 years working on Microsoft. I'm going to talk through the journey I had sort of coming to that conclusion that it would be an okay thing to do and that I could do it, and then talk through some of the process I used to learn the new platform after dedicating my life to one technology platform before, and talk about some of the things I've learned in the handful of months that I've been using Node and React full time. So kind of a quick poll. How many of you here are working on the Microsoft stack now? An awful lot of you. Okay, I wasn't sure. There's not a whole lot of Microsoft stuff on the agenda for this week at Øredev. I was here last year, and it seemed like there was a lot of Microsoft stuff. This year it seemed like there was less. So it's interesting. How many of you have been using Microsoft for 5 years or more? 10 years or more? 15 years or more? Awesome. So I know I'm not alone then in some of these experiences, and I hope that this helps you through the same process. And by the way, I'm not trying to sell you on Node. I'm not trying to tell you you have to leave the Microsoft stack. It's great for a lot of things, but for me it was a barrier to do new things. I fell in love with Microsoft really early on. I started writing GW Basic in high school, and then very quickly started using Quick Basic 4.5 to create my first executables. Anybody else use Quick Basic? A few of you. Does anybody remember the game Nibbles? It was like Snake, right? When Quick Basic 4.5 came out, Microsoft released it on floppy disks, and on those floppy disks were the games Nibbles and Gorilla. And they released them as source, which was really odd for Microsoft in the 90s to give source code away, right? Well, I started playing Nibbles on my 486 that was brand new, and the game was so fast it was impossible to play unless I turned my turbo button off, right? And I thought, well, this is stupid. I love this game. I want to play it, but I don't want to have to turn my turbo button off. So I started editing the source code to Nibbles and ended up completely rewriting the game. And this is where I fell in love with BASIC and programming in general. I became a professional developer in the late 90s and started using ASP in 1999 to build line-of-business web applications. And that's what I spent most of my career building, are those line-of-business apps. And after ASP, I started using .NET really early on. In fact, the day ASP.NET 1.0 beta was released, I got my hands on it. I was at the launch party, and I went home and started writing ASP.NET code that day. I was in the middle of writing a project for Procter & Gamble. So everybody know who Procter & Gamble is? They make like soap and shampoo and stuff like that. I was building a point-of-sale system for them with the barcode scanner and everything, and I had been building it in ASP and VBScript. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to use .NET. Right, so the first day it was available, I started writing .NET code. When we released that project, it was about 60% classic ASP, about 40% ASP.NET. So I blended those two platforms together on my first project with .NET. And then when certifications for .NET became available, I got certified in ASP.NET 1.0 with Visual Basic .NET the first month that certification was available. I was really proud of that. And I've kept up with the .NET framework and everything that's grown out of it since then. I was really proud of a lot of what I had done, and I was proud to be so dedicated to Microsoft. But there were some things I wasn't real proud of either. When Linux started gaining popularity and open source was getting some traction, honestly, I sort of listened to Steve Ballmer. Open source is cancer. Oh no, I don't want cancer. Right? So I shunned all that stuff, and I avoided it. I was loyal to the platform. This platform has done so much for me. Why would I want to learn something like Ruby? I don't want to do that. I'm happy with .NET. And I just kept doubling down on this. So coming to conferences like this and hearing about all these different technologies kind of opened my eyes to some of the mistakes I made. I used IE through the entire wave of Firefox until Chrome came out. That's how dedicated to Microsoft I was. I refused to use Firefox, right? When Chrome came out, it was like, okay, maybe IE is kind of weighing me down. I'll try something different. I'm not real happy about those choices. Those choices did lead me to a job at Microsoft in 2008, though. So that was kind of interesting. And I joined to work on something called Silverlight. Does anybody here use Silverlight or have used it? I was super excited about Silverlight. Back before it was called Silverlight, it was called WPF/E, WPF Everywhere. And I read about the announcement. I'm like, oh my goodness, .NET in the browser, this is amazing. Right? I wanted to have one language on the server and in the client, be able to have my business logic shared across, and build really big, rich internet applications for a line of business. So I went to Microsoft to help build that out. I worked on the Silverlight SDK and a product called WCF RIA Services, which blended Silverlight together with the .NET framework. So we actually tied ASP.NET and Silverlight together, so you could build an ASP.NET backend with the Silverlight frontend, and do what we would consider today to be an isomorphic or universal web app, except all the rendering was done on the client in Silverlight. But the idea was basically the same. After working on the .NET framework for a while, I was dev lead for ASP.NET web pages and Razor, and I also became the dev lead for the NuGet project. In fact, last year, I was here speaking about NuGet and some of the big work we were doing on that project. Ironically, while I was here last year, some conversations I had with people made me realize that I was no longer doing what I loved. I had lost sight of my passion, which is building large line of business web apps. Yeah, NuGet has a website, NuGet.org, but it's not the priority for the project, and it's not a big line of business app. And the users were developers. And I'm sorry, but you guys are all jerks. Developers are really hard to please, right? And didn't matter what we did, it wasn't good enough. And the work we were doing was so abstract that I had a hard time getting a sense of accomplishment out of the project. So I was missing that. But really, I wanted to focus on user interfaces again. I wanted to build big user interfaces for business users and solve actual problems, concrete ones, instead of abstract ones. So that led me to look for a new job doing that kind of thing. And it seemed like these were the technologies that all the companies were using or wanting to use on their job postings. I shouldn't say all. There's a lot of .NET stuff out there, a lot of old .NET stuff out there. And there's some companies wanting to use ASP.NET vNext. It's a pretty exciting technology. I was working on that while I was working on NuGet. And my instinct was, of course, I'm going to use ASP.NET. But when I started seeing some of these jobs that were really interesting on these platforms, I wondered, like, could I overcome a platform change? I had never done it before in my career. I had done everything I had done was Microsoft, right? It's all I know. Starting with VB, right? I kind of ignored Quick Basic here because I don't think there are screenshots of Quick Basic because it's before the internet. But anyway, starting with VB, I then learned ASP, right? And this was a big thing for Visual Basic developers to be able to build web apps with languages we were familiar with. Yeah, VB script was different, but it brought a lot of my knowledge forward. And then I mentioned ASP.NET. That came out. Wow, that was a huge shift. And it changed the way we built software in the Microsoft stack. And I got pretty good. Like I said, I got certified in ASP.NET 1.0 with Visual Basic and built some really big apps with it. And then ASP.NET 2.0 came out. Does anybody remember when 2.0 came out with website projects and they got rid of web applications? Anybody else remember that? It was pretty short-lived, where the new version of Visual Studio took away the project type that we had gotten used to with ASP.NET 1.0. And there was kind of a revolt. And I remember Scott Guthrie blogging about it, saying, mea culpa, we thought this new model was really valuable. And they add an update to Visual Studio that reintroduced the web application project type. But sort of in between those, I learned how to build ASP.NET 2.0 websites. Then I had a little hiatus away from web apps, and I learned some WinForms stuff and built up a pretty big system for a healthcare waste management company with WinForms. On my hiatus is when MVC came out. And I started using that on the very next project. I really liked ASP.NET MVC. Who here uses ASP.NET MVC today? handful. How many of you are still using web forms? A few, OK. Anybody remember ASP.NET Ajax? Yeah, a few of us, right? It was kind of hard to work with, but it was what was prescribed. As we started to try to build things out in the client, we had a programming model in JavaScript that felt very familiar to what we understood on the server. So I learned this and built a few projects on that until Microsoft told us to stop doing that and use jQuery instead. And I was like, holy crap, you told me not to use jQuery before. So I was making fun of all my friends that were learning that stupid $ thing. And now you're telling me that I should be using that. So I learned jQuery, built some projects on that. And then WPF. I learned XAML. XAML was just a mind bend when it first came out. But once you got into it, it was pretty powerful. And that's what led me to like Silverlight. And then, like I said, while I was at Microsoft, I was the dev lead for Razor. Who's using the Razor syntax engine now? A lot of you, cool. So I learned that, and that was quite a bit different from web forms. And you could use it in both web pages and MVC. And then all this tied together with NuGet. I learned how to build things that were based on NuGet packages. And this was a big shift for the Microsoft platform. And then Azure started to catch on. Like, oh, and I need to go learn this. So like my own personal blog and some websites that I run, I moved them off of GoDaddy and moved them into Azure and started running them there. And then while I was working on NuGet, of course, NuGet is built on the Azure platform, and we were part of that group. So I learned a lot about Azure. So I've spent my entire career, 15 to 20 years, depending on how you do the math, on the Microsoft platform. But I've changed platforms 12 times. Right? We don't think about it. We think about being dedicated to the Microsoft platform. But over 15, that was 15 years that I just showed you that had 12 significant platform changes. And that doesn't even count Windows Phone. Anybody here write Windows Phone apps? How frustrating has that been? Every version is a brand new platform, right? Oh, you were doing it wrong before. Sorry about that. So with this mindset, realize that platform change, while it seemed scary, I've done it a bunch of times. I can do it again. Yeah, JavaScript's going to be a different language, and there's going to be different traits about that language. But the platform change itself should not be scary. If you've spent any time in the Microsoft platform, you're used to it. So then the next question was, can I get a job? How do I go apply for one of these jobs where the requirements are Node, JavaScript, and then preferably experience with React? How do I sell myself? How do I go and walk in the door and say, I have never used the technology you're wanting to use, but please hire me? Right? How do you do that? Well, I started thinking about what skills I have that are independent of the platform. What are some of the things I've done over the last 20 years that are going to be valuable regardless of what technology I'm using? Ultimately, I talk to businesses, interview their employees, understand the business domain, and I write code that solves their business problems. I'm sure you all do the same. How many of you build what we would call a line of business app? Okay, that's what I spent my whole career doing on 12 different platforms. Right? I've helped teams grow. I've been on teams where I was the first one on the team, and we grew to 20 plus people. I joined teams that we were 5 or 6 people, helped grow to 20. And then I've also scaled teams down when it's appropriate too. I've worked well with lots of different business groups, external and internal partner teams, and I generally have a good reputation with QA. They like the code I deliver, and I help them test my products. I architect things pretty well. I separate logic. I understand that that UI platform that I'm using for Microsoft is going to change next year. But my business logic layer, my data access layer, relatively sturdy. So I understand how to identify what kind of logic each thing is and put it in the right place. And with that, I get testability. And I also have experience migrating from one platform to another. One of the biggest projects I've ever worked on was building out the school system for the state of Ohio in the US. We replaced a mainframe. And the reason why we had to replace the mainframe is because they were literally running out of vacuum tubes for their mainframe. They were buying them all up on eBay, and they couldn't find any more. So the clock was ticking, and they hired my company and said, please help. We've been working on this project for 3 years, and we're having a hard time finishing. Right? And of course, their definition of finishing was they needed to start over. But in 2 years' time, we went from the first line of code to having 3 school districts up and running on this new ASP.NET SQL Server system. And then a couple of years later, we had 680 school districts using the software. So in a very short period of time, I helped this company rewrite a 40-year-old mainframe as a web app and get it online. Ultimately, I shipped software, right? And through this, I've used lots of different technologies, and I'm sure you have too, even if they're all under the umbrella of the name Microsoft. So with this, I got a job at Concur. We do travel and expense software. And the code base is almost 20 years old. There's a lot of ASP. There's a lot of ASP.NET. And the company wanted to start using Node and React and sort of reimagine our user interface layer. So I talked to them and emphasized all the stuff I've done in my career that would be valuable. And I was honest. Said, no, I know you're wanting to use Node and React. I will let you know. I've not used those technologies yet. I have a family. I'm dedicated to my current job until my last day. I don't think I'm going to have time to learn these new technologies before I start. Is that going to be okay? And I think when they looked at the other skills that I bring to the table, they decided it was worth the investment. And in fact, it wasn't just me that they made this investment in. My entire team, a lot of them were old-timers at Concur. They'd been there for 10, 15 years. All they knew was ASP and ASP.NET as well. So they were investing in the whole team, including new people like me that they were hiring in. So you know what? We're going to use these new technologies, and we want to give you the time to learn them before we force you to put them into place. And that was an amazing opportunity that Concur gave me and has given the team. And any company that's going to make this kind of a change, I hope that they too come to the conclusion that it's worth that upfront investment. So, day one, I show up at my new job, go through orientation, go sit down at my desk. I'm like, all right, let's write some Node. First thing I do is I pull up Node.js.org. Here's the example. Has anybody here run this sample before? A few of you, okay. It's super simple, right? That's a web server. And you look at it like, where's the framework? Like, what is that it? Right? And you're not really sure. So I did that. I'm like, OK, that's OK. So I went and started studying the API documentation. And NPM, who's heard of NPM? A lot of you. OK. So it's the package manager for Node. When I was working on NuGet, I did a lot of competitive analysis of NPM, studied its features really well. So I kind of understood the premise of Node and NPM from being sort of a competitor to it, but honestly hadn't used it. So I started studying what packages were available and sort of what was popular. But the next thing I did, so I took some time, grabbed myself a Pluralsight subscription, and I found this course by Sean Wildermuth called Node.js for the .NET Developers. It's a great course. I highly recommend it. Sean does a really good job of talking about the concepts we're familiar with on .NET and how they translate over to Node. And from that, I worked through and built a web app. He built a sample web app in the course, and I had that working. And I learned Express, which is our router. For those of you on the .NET framework, how many of you have used Owen? Only a few. So Owen teaches us about middleware. And generally, the idea is a request response goes through the pipeline, and middleware can plug in anywhere on that pipeline. They can party on the request. They can party on the response. Express does routing and has the opportunity for middlewares to plug in. So I learned Express, again, just the surface. View engines. Node lets you use all kinds of different view engines. And this is different from what we saw in ASP.NET, where you're kind of married to the view engine. There's web forms, there's ASPX, and there's Razor, the CSHTML. But really, to go beyond that, to try to use a different view engine, you're really fighting the platform to do so. With Node, these things just plug in, because you're just composing your app together. You're composing your framework. So when we looked at that initial Node web server, there's very little to it, because the expectation is you're going to bring in everything else you need. So even though the course didn't cover React in any way, shape, or form, I knew that React was just another view engine. Who here has used React yet? A handful of you. Who knows what React is? Okay, so React advertises itself as the V in your MVC. They're only your view. React does not have any say in your model. It does not have any say in your controller. So I knew, okay, well, it's just a view, so it's my view engine. So I went into the course exercise, and I added a React view, and as an alternative to EGS and Bash, for instance. And then it's like, okay, I got Hello World working. Now I need to learn React a little bit better. So I did what every professional does. I went to Google and said, getting started with React. Actually, I'm going to out myself. I actually went to Bing. I'm still a little bit dedicated to Microsoft. I actually like Bing almost all the time. So that's a lie, but anyway. I knew if I said Bing, you would have just laughed at me. The problem I had with those search results, though, is there are hundreds of getting started with React tutorials, React starter kits, like React boilerplate, hundreds and hundreds of them. And 99.9% of them say, here's how to get started with React. Clone my repo, and you're good to go. And then you clone it, and you're like, what now? And you start looking, and there's like 35 NPM modules referenced by the project. Like, I don't understand. And there's all these different concepts that have been composed in. Things like Webpack. Does anybody know what Webpack is? Only a few. So Webpack lets you take code that you wrote for Node with module references and things like that, and bundle it into a client-side bundle that can then be used to run that same JavaScript. Although it's been transpiled, it's still the same JavaScript. You can run that in the browser. And you can create all kinds of different bundle shapes. It's a really powerful framework. Some of you might have heard of Browserify. Anybody are more hands up for Browserify? A few more. So Webpack is a layer above that. It really gives a good framework. But it was things like that. Like, okay, there's Webpack Dev Server, there's React Hot Loader, and there's countless list of modules. And some of them have really stupid names, like Chokidar. Does anybody know what Chokidar is? Yeah. I'll let you go look that one up. They have these names, and Babel is another one. Babel does transpiling for us. So you're looking at package.json, you're like, I don't know what any of these things are. It was too much. I got lucky again with Concur. Right around this time, these two gentlemen, Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence, who are really prolific in the React community, they're the people behind React Router, they started giving React.js training sessions. And Concur was willing to send myself and a handful of other members from my team to one of their first sessions, which happened to be in Seattle. So the timing was just perfect. They travel all around the world, or I guess around the country. I think they're working to come over here as well. But they put on a really good training session. And they teach one concept at a time. They have it's like a 20-point exercise that we work through over a couple of days. And they introduce Webpack as one thing. They introduce Webpack Dev Server, which is sort of like your IIS Express for Webpack. They introduced that at one time. And it clicked for me. I realized, oh, that was what was happening. I was trying to learn too many things at once. So I left that, and I decided, or after I finished that training session, I wanted to put what I learned there to the test. Could I start from scratch and create an isomorphic or universal React Node web app? Does server-side rendering, client-side rendering, and I just wanted it to be a hello world kind of thing, but starting from scratch instead of cloning somebody's repo. And I wanted to take notes along the way. So each step I went through, I wrote down a whole bunch of markdown for what I just introduced. Which concept did I just add into the project as a stepping stone toward my final goal? And I started it with just a readme.md and the root of my repo, and I was committing like every 10 minutes I was doing a git commit. Here's roughly the process I went through. I started with a Hello World web server that I knew from Node. Like, okay, I get that. There's not a whole lot to that. The next thing is to add React in to do server-side rendering. Has anybody seen the JSX syntax before? I see a few heads nodding. So it's this stuff here that looks like HTML, but you'll notice it's just loose inside my JavaScript file. It's not actually in a string. So Babel is being used here, but React also has a React JSX tool that you can take a file that is like this, name it with a .jsx extension or JS if you want, run it through this transpiler, and it will find this markup-looking stuff and turn it into React JavaScript calls. So I got that in place, and in order to do so, I had to use some of the React tooling to do that, and that made my development a little bit slow. I'm used to Visual Studio. I'm used to like F5 and everything just works. But using Node and React, I'm in Sublime and I have my console open. And so I found myself going back and forth between those two quite a bit. But I then used Gulp. Anybody here heard of Gulp? Microsoft's starting to promote it a little bit too. It's a tool that can be used to create a build system. And we see this a lot in Node. So I then introduced that. So that was one concrete step. Like, OK, here's one concept of learning Gulp and getting that in place to automate a lot of the stuff I'm doing on the command line. So I can watch my JavaScript, my JSX files, and as I change them, it'll rebuild my JavaScript. It's a little weird, but yes, you do build your JavaScript. In fact, right now, the project I'm on, our JavaScript build is actually taking longer than our .NET build, because there's that. The next step after I had that working is like, OK, now I can iterate on my React components faster. And I wanted to introduce the next concept, which is a React component. So see here, I've got hello world in what looks like an HTML tag. Now, that's not going to get sent to the browser as a hello world tag. This isn't like a web component kind of thing. React is going to render that hello world component, which will turn itself into a div. It'll return a div element. I got this working. I'm rendering React components from the server. The next thing I wanted to do is render React on the client. Now, I had done this in some of the tutorials I'd been through. I did it in the Node.js for the .NET Developer course. And I plugged it in here, and this looked gnarly. Like, holy crap, I have to like build up these weird strings because this isn't actually JSX here. I want to send this all this code down to the browser and let the browser run this JavaScript. I stumbled on this step quite a bit to get it right. I thought, you know what, it's all right. I'm going to let it be ugly. I'm going to get it to work while it's ugly. And then I'll have another iteration to make it prettier, and then prettier, and prettier. And that had to be OK. You know, to be honest, a lot of development on the Microsoft platform, we're used to rapid application development, where the code kind of looks pretty when you first start, and then 7 years later, you come back to it, and you're like, ugh, or you're trying to add some feature, and you're like, ugh, right? So this was OK. I got it working, and then I refactored it to use JSX. And Webpack did a lot of the work for me here. So there's a bunch of steps in between 5 and 6 to get to this point, but I got it working. And something I did here that was really noteworthy. On this server, so this is now what we're rendering from our server. This is back to our Node.js web server. I've got my hello world component in here, but then I have these script tags and a script source out to my timestamp. I created a hello world component to render from the server, and I created a timestamp component to render on the client. And I did those separately so I could look at those concepts individually. I wanted to thoroughly understand server-side rendering as a unit and thoroughly understand client-side rendering as a unit, and then work toward the middle. Because I found that a lot of the isomorphic stuff, it gets really confusing where the server's job is done and the client's job begins. So keeping those separate was really helpful for me. And the last step was bringing it together so that I would render both hello world and timestamp on the server and on the client. So I went from the server to isomorphic and client to isomorphic. And when I completed that, my project was done. I then took that README file, which turned out to be about 20 pages long, and turned it into a 20-step tutorial. So yeah, there's 7 overarching steps along the way. But on this site, if you go through it, you find it on my GitHub site, username Jeff Handley. There's actually 20 incremental steps that get you to the end goal of that isomorphic app. I then shared this out with other people that were joining our team and said, hey, this is the exercise I went through to learn Node and React. And they went through it. They found some bugs, sent me pull requests. But But the end result was they were very pleased with how quickly this got them to a deeper understanding, much better than what you get from git clone. Right? Building it up from scratch, learning the concepts one at a time was really important. After that, I told my manager, hey, I feel like I'm getting there. I feel like I can do some stuff. Let's build some real screens. So this is one that I built up as a demo. I'm going to show this tomorrow morning in my next session. I took the Øredev session data and built a CRUD screen over it as a demonstration for this week. But it represents the same kind of screen I went and tackled at work. Create, read, update, delete, line of business screen. A lot of you said you build line of business apps. I'm sure you understand that thing pretty well. Our project then built out, or our team built out a few of those kinds of screens, and we wanted to do some more. The approach, and this is kind of where we are now. We've built some of those admin screens, and we're wanting to go tackle some of our bigger, more complicated workflow screens, and sort of put our knowledge to the test. The approach I'm trying to use for my team is to diversify our investments. I don't want to jump directly from admin screens to the hardest screens in our app without continuing to learn. But we have hundreds of admin screens. If we only do those, it'll be years before we get to the things that really matter. So at any point in time, what I expect is going to be going on my team is somebody will be working on some low-hanging fruit, easy admin screens. Somebody will be working on a really hard screen, and somebody else will be working on something kind of in the middle. And then we'll rotate. So each of us will have that opportunity to work on different kinds of screens and really push our understandings to a limit, but just continue to learn while we test ourselves. And then we get to sort of circle back and come back to those easy screens and see how much easier we can make them after learning some stuff that's a little bit harder. And one of the things I'm going to sort of go a little bit deeper on tomorrow morning in my other talk is in large line of business apps, the architecture and design that you put in place for these admin screens generally dominates your application. And your workflow screens build on top of that same architecture and design. So there's a lot that we're going to transfer over. So I want to talk through some traps that I've seen myself and other members of my team run into over the last handful of months while we've been going through this exercise. First is choosing modules is really hard because there's thousands and thousands of NPM modules out there, hundreds of them that all do the same thing. Like, which ones do I use? It's like you start a new project, create a new folder, git init, like npm install what? We found ourselves deliberating a lot on which modules to pick. One where it really surfaced for our team was on that build system. There are really two main alternatives. There's Grunt and there's Gulp. Both of them are really popular. Like, which one do we use? And we stagnated a bit. In fact, my first day at Concur, during stand-up, somebody on the team said, hey, I really need to know whether we're going to pick Grunt or Gulp because my next work item depends on it. So we ultimately came to the position that you have to just pick something and move on and continue using that module until it isn't the right fit for you anymore. And the way you can do that is prepare to replace it with something else later on. You're also going to be seeking guidance. We're used to Visual Studio giving us project templates, file a new project, run through a couple wizards, and you have an end-to-end app. And you never really had to think about things along the way to get sort of those projects working. And there's also copious documentation on the Microsoft platform giving you very prescriptive guidance. You're not going to find that in the Node ecosystem, and that's OK. Because in the .NET or Microsoft world, you can kind of go from project to project, and everything looks pretty similar. Right? The business domain is going to be different, but the overall architecture is roughly the same. You've got a data access layer, business logic layer, UI layer, connect them together, build your app. Right? They all pretty much look like that. And the things that connect them together look similar. Well, in the Node world, since we're composing things together to fit our project's need, every project looks pretty different. And you can even see that on some of these starter kit apps. There's not a whole lot of similarity or consistency across them. And you have to recognize that that's going to be OK. And once you've built something, don't try to compare what you've built to other things you see out there and question what you've done. because it's going to be different, and you just have to accept that. The next one, and this kind of goes without saying, but don't try to make JavaScript an object-oriented language, at least not your first step. Yeah, ECMAScript 6 introduces classes, and it's a tool that's there to be used, but don't make it the first thing you go to. Use JavaScript for what it is. You're also going to expect problems to arise. Platform after platform, version of the framework after version of the framework with .NET. How many of you feel like you've solved the same problem 10 different times on the Microsoft platform, right? Every new version comes out like, oh, I guess I better go write X. Fill in the blank, right? Better go write validation, model binding. Like all these things, it's the same problem over and over again. So then when the new version comes out, you're like, okay, I know what problems I'm going to have to solve. And you go in and solve them. It's like the first thing you do is solve all your cross-cutting concerns. Oh, let me put logging in this new way, right? Don't expect those same problems to arise when you're using JavaScript. JavaScript, Node in particular, has a completely different set of shortcomings. It has a completely different set of advantages. Do not, absolutely do not, cast the problems that you have with .NET and Microsoft Platform onto Node. Because if you do, you'll be prematurely solving problems that might not even surface, which actually introduces those problems, and at the same time, you throw away all the good parts of Node. So use Node for what it is and only solve the problems that you actually encounter there. And sort of a continuation of that is don't try to coerce the platform into something that you're used to. Who here has used ASP.NET data sources or two-way data binding kinds of technologies? WPF really introduced us to that. I see people introducing two-way data binding and the data source concept into Node. Just don't do that. Do not abstract or put an abstraction layer around your data access. Like, oh, I don't want to know if this is local or remote data. Like, don't do that because it matters. Those are the kinds of things that make a difference. Don't try to design reusable components first. Instead, build the things outside of those reusable components that need to use them, and let the usage of these components dictate those designs. Because I guarantee you, even though you've built that component 20 times on the Microsoft platform, the APIs, the design you're going to have for any reusable component is going to be drastically different if you let your usage of it dictate what that API should be by writing your app first. So another way to say this is don't worry about the implementation of how you're going to actually do things like sorting or paging or validation or anything else you've done 100 times. Don't worry about how you're actually going to sort. Think about where in your application you need to be able to call into that function and build that out. Put a placeholder implementation in there, knowing that you're going to come in and either flush it out or replace it with an NPM module. And I talked about how you need to prepare for swapping modules out. You do that by de-emphasizing the implementation and concentrating more on how it's going to plug in and limiting the impact it's going to make on your app when you swap it out. You have to learn the framework for what it is. You have to listen to it. And this is something that I discovered pretty early on, about a month into using Node. I'm like, oh my goodness, so much stuff is different that I do not want to try to use it in the way I'm familiar with. I just need to listen to the platform. I need to use it. I need to feel it. It kind of ends up being a little spiritual. But you really have to let the platform tell you where its problems and shortcomings are. And what its benefits and advantages are too. So I'm almost 7 months into this process of using Node and React on a daily basis. And sort of in hindsight, I've realized that I had this illusion that I was dedicated to a platform. I was loyal to it. The Microsoft platform had done so much for me. I'd built my career on it. I felt like I owed the platform something back. I felt like I owed it my loyalty. I didn't. Now again, I'm not trying to tell you to ditch Microsoft. The platform does some great things. But the platform hasn't built your apps, right? I've done a lot with the platforms I've used. I can do those same things on a new platform. And to kind of close, just reiterate this last point. If you do make a platform switch, learn it, study it, use it for what it is. Don't try to make it something it's not. So that's all I have today. Again, I'm talking more tomorrow morning on how I'm actually using Node and React to build line of business apps. So if this is something that's more still interesting to you, please come to that talk too. Thanks a lot.